Hi guys. Have you ever wondered what it was like to struggle with your mind in a time when the very concept of mental health didn't exist as we know it today? Imagine living in an era where the thoughts racing through your head, the overwhelming sadness that won't lift, or the voices only you can hear might be blamed on demons, curses, or an imbalance of bodily fluids. Tonight, we're taking a journey back to medieval times, roughly spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, to explore what mental health was really like during this fascinating, yet often misunderstood period of history. We'll walk through the cobblestone streets of medieval villages, peek inside monasteries where monks copied ancient texts, visit the homes of healers who mixed herbs by candlelight, and even enter the cold stone walls where society's most troubled minds were hidden away. This isn't just a story about the past, though. It's about understanding how far we've come in recognizing mental health as a fundamental part of being human, and perhaps how some medieval attitudes still echo in our world today. We'll explore the theories that shaped medieval understanding of the mind, the treatments that ranged from surprisingly gentle to shockingly harsh, the role of religion in explaining mental distress, and the everyday lives of people who experienced what we would now recognize as mental health conditions. Along the way, you'll discover that medieval people were far more complex in their understanding than popular culture often suggests, and that compassion and cruelty often existed side by side in their approach to those who suffered. So get comfortable, because we're about to spend the next few hours together exploring one of history's most intriguing questions. What happened when your mind broke in a world that barely understood what a mind was? Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. To truly understand mental health in medieval times, we need to first understand the world these people inhabited, because the medieval mindset was fundamentally different from our own in ways that shaped every aspect of how they viewed the human condition. The medieval world was one where the supernatural and natural were not clearly separated as they are in modern secular thinking, where miracles could happen at any moment, where demons and angels were as real as the trees and stones, and where the boundary between this world and the next felt permeable and thin. People lived their entire lives within walking distance of where they were born, their horizons limited by the physical landscape they could see with their own eyes, and their understanding of the wider world shaped by stories, rumors, and the teachings of the church rather than by maps, books, or personal travel. Time itself was experienced differently in the medieval world, measured not by precise mechanical clocks, but by the sun's position, the ringing of church bells calling the faithful to prayer at the canonical hours, and the rhythm of agricultural seasons that dictated when to plow, plant, and harvest. There was no artificial lighting beyond candles and rushlights, so when darkness fell, it fell absolutely, and the night was a time of danger and mystery when evil spirits were thought to roam more freely. The sounds of medieval life were entirely different from what we experience today. No mechanical hum of engines or electronics, but instead the sounds of animals, human voices, church bells, the clatter of wooden wheels on stone, the hammer of the blacksmith, and the underlying silence that most modern people never experience. Disease was everywhere, and often inexplicable. A person could be healthy in the morning and dead by evening, from what we now know as bacterial infection, but which medieval people could only understand as God's will, demonic influence, or astrological misfortune. Children died in shocking numbers, with perhaps half not surviving to adulthood, and this constant presence of death shaped medieval attitudes toward life, suffering, and the value of earthly existence compared to eternal salvation. Medieval Europe was a world divided into roughly three estates: those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked, and this rigid social structure influenced everything from where you lived to how your suffering was interpreted. The clergy, the first estate, held enormous power, not just over spiritual matters, but over education, literacy, record-keeping, and the preservation of knowledge itself. Monasteries served as libraries, schools, hospitals, and centers of agricultural innovation, while parish priests were often the only literate people in rural communities. The nobility, the warrior class who fought, lived by codes of honor and violence. Their lives centered on warfare, feudal obligations, and the display of power through tournaments, feasting, and patronage. The vast majority of people, perhaps 90% of the population, were peasants who worked the land, lived in small villages of perhaps a few dozen to a few hundred people, and knew grinding poverty and unceasing labor as the basic conditions of existence. Social mobility was extremely limited, with most people dying in the same social position they were born into. And this stability meant that identity was largely fixed by birth rather than achievement. The feudal system bound people to the land they worked and to the lords who owned that land, creating a web of mutual obligations that structured all social relationships. The manor was the basic economic unit, a largely self-sufficient estate where peasants farmed the lord's land in exchange for protection and the right to farm small plots for themselves. Villages were tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, where privacy was virtually unknown, and where communal activities from plowing to harvesting to celebrating religious festivals bound people together in ways that could be both supportive and suffocating. The church calendar structured the year with its cycle of feast days and fasts, creating rhythm and meaning in lives that might otherwise seem like endless toil. Markets and fairs provided occasional breaks from routine and opportunities for trade, news, and entertainment. Guilds in towns and cities organized craftsmen and merchants, regulating quality, training apprentices, and providing mutual aid to members. The family was the fundamental social and economic unit, with marriages arranged for practical and economic reasons as often as for affection, and with multiple generations often living together in close quarters. Women's lives were generally more restricted than men's, with their primary roles defined as wife, mother, and household manager, though widows might gain more independence and women in certain trades or religious life might have more autonomy. Children were expected to contribute to household labor from a young age, and childhood as a protected period of innocence and play was largely a luxury of the wealthy. The Catholic Church dominated not just spiritual life, but intellectual life as well, serving as the primary keeper of knowledge, the main provider of what we might call health care, and the ultimate authority on questions of the soul and mind. When a medieval person experienced what we would call depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, or any other mental health condition, they didn't have the vocabulary we have today. Instead, they might describe themselves as melancholic, possessed, cursed, moonstruck, or simply mad. The very concept of mental illness as a medical condition separate from moral failing or spiritual affliction was still centuries away from full development. Medieval people lived in a world without electricity, where darkness was truly dark and silence was truly silent, where the average person might never travel more than 10 miles from their birthplace, and where life expectancy hovered somewhere in the 30s if you survived childhood. Death was everywhere, from plagues that could wipe out a third of the population to simple infections that turned deadly, and this constant proximity to mortality shaped how people understood suffering of all kinds. The natural world felt more alive and more threatening than it does to us today. Forests were places where bandits and wolves lurked. Storms could destroy your entire harvest and condemn you to starvation, and disease could strike without warning or apparent reason. In this context, mental distress was just one more mysterious and frightening force in a world full of them, and people reached for the explanatory frameworks they had available: ancient medical texts, religious doctrine, folklore, and superstition. The medieval period wasn't the intellectual wasteland that popular culture sometimes portrays, but it was a time when different ways of knowing, empirical observation, religious faith, classical learning, and folk wisdom all existed simultaneously and often contradicted each other. Understanding mental health in this era means understanding this complex web of beliefs and the very real people who tried to make sense of their suffering within it. The foundation of medieval medical understanding rested heavily on classical texts that had been preserved and transmitted through the centuries, particularly the works of ancient Greek and Roman physicians, whose ideas would dominate European medicine for over 1,000 years. The most influential of these ancient authorities was Hippocrates, the Greek physician often called the father of medicine, who lived in the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era. Hippocrates and his followers developed the theory of the four humors, which would become the primary lens through which medieval physicians understood both physical and mental health. According to this theory, the human body contained 4 vital fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and health depended on maintaining the proper balance among these humors. Each humor was associated with particular qualities. Blood was hot and moist, phlegm was cold and moist, yellow bile was hot and dry, and black bile was cold and dry, and each was also linked to one of the 4 elements that the ancients believed made up all matter: air, water, fire, and earth. When the humors were in balance, a person enjoyed good health, but when one humor became excessive or deficient, illness resulted, and this applied to diseases of the mind just as much as diseases of the body. A person with too much blood might become sanguine, cheerful and optimistic, but perhaps overly so, while someone with excess phlegm would be phlegmatic, calm and unemotional to the point of lethargy. Too much yellow bile produced a choleric temperament, quick to anger and aggression, while an excess of black bile caused melancholia, the medieval term for what we would largely recognize as depression. This theory was further developed by Galen, a Roman physician of the 2nd century who wrote extensively and whose works were considered nearly as authoritative as Hippocrates throughout the medieval period. Galen expanded on humoral theory and tied it closely to the concept of the non-naturals, 6 factors that physicians believed influenced the balance of humors: air, food and drink, sleep and waking, motion and rest, excretion and retention, and the passions of the soul. By adjusting these factors, medieval physicians believed they could restore humoral balance and thereby cure disease, including diseases of the mind. The theory was elegant, comprehensive, and completely wrong by modern standards, but it represented a genuine attempt to understand health as a natural phenomenon rather than purely supernatural, and it gave medieval healers a framework for intervention. The sophistication of humoral theory should not be underestimated, despite its fundamental incorrectness, because it was a comprehensive system that attempted to explain not just health and disease, but also personality, emotion, and the relationship between mind and body. Medieval physicians trained in humoral theory learned to make incredibly detailed observations of their patients, noting not just obvious symptoms, but subtle signs in complexion, pulse quality, urine color and consistency, tongue appearance, and behavioral patterns. The practice of uroscopy, examining urine for diagnostic purposes, reached extraordinary levels of complexity, with physicians distinguishing dozens of different colors, clarities, and sediments, each supposedly indicating different states of health or imbalance. Pulse diagnosis was similarly elaborate, with multiple pulse points examined and subtle variations in rhythm, strength, and quality noted and interpreted. This attention to detail, while based on incorrect theory, did train medieval physicians to be careful observers and to treat each patient as an individual rather than simply applying one-size-fits-all treatments. The connection between diet and health was taken very seriously in humoral medicine, and medieval dietary advice, while based on incorrect ideas about hot, cold, wet, and dry properties of foods, did recognize that what a person ate affected their physical and mental state. Medical texts included detailed dietary prescriptions for different conditions, different seasons, different ages, and different temperaments, showing a real understanding that nutrition mattered, even if the specific recommendations were often misguided. The concept of the non-naturals, those 6 factors that influenced humoral balance, created a framework for what we might call lifestyle medicine or preventive care, encouraging people to pay attention to air quality, diet, sleep, exercise, elimination, and emotional state as factors affecting overall health. This holistic approach, seeing the person as a whole organism affected by multiple factors rather than just a collection of symptoms, has actually come back into favor in modern integrative medicine, even though the underlying humoral theory has been completely abandoned. Medieval medicine also recognized the importance of the patient's environment and recommended changes of air, meaning travel to different climates for various conditions, understanding that environment affected health even if the mechanism was misunderstood. The role of astrology in medieval medicine added another layer of complexity, with physicians believing that the positions of planets and stars at the time of birth influenced a person's temperament, and that celestial movements continued to affect health throughout life. Certain times were considered better or worse for medical treatments, and many physicians would consult astrological charts before undertaking major interventions like surgery or prescribing powerful medicines. While we now know astrology has no actual effect on health, this practice did encourage physicians to time treatments carefully and to consider whether conditions were optimal before proceeding, which wasn't entirely a bad instinct, even if the reasoning was flawed. When a medieval physician encountered someone experiencing what we'd call mental illness, they would first try to determine which humor was out of balance. They might examine the patient's complexion, pulse, urine, and behavior, ask about their diet and lifestyle, and consider external factors like the weather and the season, since different seasons were associated with different humors. This diagnostic process could be surprisingly thorough and showed a genuine commitment to understanding the patient as an individual, even if the underlying theory was flawed. A physician examining a melancholic patient might note their pale or dark complexion, their slow pulse, their cloudy urine with dark sediment, their withdrawn behavior and sad expression, their poor appetite and disturbed sleep, and from these observations conclude that black bile was in excess. The physician would then inquire about the patient's recent history. Had they suffered a great loss or disappointment? Had they been eating heavy, melancholic foods like beef or lentils? Had they been spending too much time in study or solitary contemplation? Were they getting enough sleep and exercise? The answers to these questions would help the physician understand not just what was wrong, but why it had gone wrong, allowing for a more targeted intervention. Medieval medical case histories, preserved in various manuscripts, show physicians grappling seriously with their patients' mental health problems, describing symptoms in detail, proposing explanations, and following up on the results of treatment. While the explanations were incorrect by modern standards, the approach of careful observation, detailed history-taking, and individualized treatment was sound medical practice that would be recognized by any modern physician. The relationship between physician and patient in medieval medicine was often quite personal, especially for wealthy patients who could afford extended consultations, with the physician serving not just as a medical advisor, but as a counselor on all aspects of healthy living. For mental health concerns in particular, this personal relationship could be therapeutic in itself, providing the patient with someone who took their suffering seriously, who had an explanatory framework to make sense of troubling symptoms, and who offered hope for improvement through treatment. The placebo effect, though not understood in those terms, would have been operating in many cases, with the patient's belief in the physician's knowledge and the treatment's efficacy producing real psychological benefits. Medieval physicians also recognized that the manner of treatment mattered as much as the treatment itself, and medical ethics texts emphasized the importance of giving patients hope, speaking gently and encouragingly, maintaining confidentiality, and showing compassion. These ethical principles, while sometimes honored more in the breach than in the observance, represented ideals that good physicians strove to uphold. The limitation, of course, was that even the most ethical and conscientious physician working within the humoral framework could do little for many serious mental health conditions, and patients who didn't respond to dietary changes, herbal medicines, and lifestyle modifications might be left with few options beyond acceptance of their condition or pursuit of religious remedies. Alongside the humoral theory inherited from classical medicine, medieval people also understood mental distress through the lens of religion, and in medieval Europe, this primarily meant Christianity and the doctrines of the Catholic Church. The Church taught that humans were composed of both body and soul, and that while the body was mortal and subject to earthly afflictions, the soul was immortal and reflected the image of God. This dualistic understanding created a complex relationship with what we'd call mental illness, because the mind seemed to exist at the boundary between body and soul, and suffering of the mind could therefore have either physical or spiritual causes, or both simultaneously. The relationship between body and soul was debated throughout the medieval period by theologians and philosophers who asked profound questions. If the soul is immortal and spiritual, how does it interact with the mortal physical body? Can physical damage to the brain affect the immaterial soul? Is mental illness a disease of the body that impairs the soul's functioning, or a corruption of the soul itself? These weren't merely academic questions, but had real implications for how mental illness was understood and treated. The dominant position, following Augustine in the early medieval period and later refined by Aquinas, held that the soul was the form of the body, meaning that body and soul were intimately united in a single human being, with each affecting the other. Physical damage could impair the soul's ability to function, just as a broken tool impairs a craftsman's ability to work, while spiritual states could affect physical health. This understanding allowed for both natural and supernatural explanations of mental illness to coexist, and a medieval person might understand their mental distress as having multiple causes operating simultaneously: a physical imbalance of humors, a spiritual trial sent by God, and perhaps also temptation from demons exploiting their vulnerability. The Church's extensive engagement with questions of suffering, sin, and salvation provided rich resources for making meaning out of mental distress, even when it couldn't provide cure. The Book of Job offered a model for understanding innocent suffering, showing that affliction wasn't always punishment for sin. The Psalms expressed every human emotion, including despair, fear, and anger, validating these feelings as part of the human experience of relating to God. Jesus' own suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane and on the cross provided a model for accepting suffering while still honestly expressing anguish. Saints' lives offered numerous examples of holy people who endured various forms of suffering, including mental anguish, and emerged stronger in faith. This theological framework meant that a person experiencing mental distress had ways to understand their suffering as potentially meaningful rather than merely arbitrary or punitive, and could see themselves as participating in a long tradition of faithful people who had struggled with similar challenges. Mental distress could be understood as a bodily illness, a humoral imbalance that affected the brain and nerves, but it could also be interpreted as a spiritual trial, a demonic affliction, or a punishment for sin. The Church's position was actually more nuanced than popular stereotypes suggest, and official Church doctrine, particularly as articulated by influential theologians like Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, generally acknowledged that many forms of mental distress had natural, physical causes and should be treated as illnesses rather than moral failings. Aquinas, drawing on Aristotle as well as Christian theology, argued that the soul used the body as its instrument, and that damage to the body, including the brain, could impair the soul's ability to function properly, just as a skilled musician couldn't play beautiful music on a broken instrument. This understanding allowed for compassion toward those suffering from mental afflictions, since they were seen as victims of bodily illness rather than spiritual corruption. However, theology also taught that demons were real, that they could tempt, torment, and even possess human beings, and that some mental disturbances might indeed be demonic in origin. The challenge for medieval people was determining which was which. Was the person raving in the street suffering from an imbalance of humors, or were they possessed by an unclean spirit, and how could you tell the difference? Various guidelines were proposed, with possession typically identified by signs like supernatural knowledge, speaking in unknown languages, demonstrating strength beyond normal human capacity, or showing an aversion to sacred objects, while natural mental illness presented as confusion, delusion, or altered behavior without these supernatural elements. In practice, this distinction was often blurry, and different authorities might disagree about any particular case. The criteria for distinguishing demonic possession from natural mental illness became increasingly sophisticated over the medieval period, particularly as church authorities sought to prevent false accusations and superstitious responses, while still maintaining the theological position that possession was possible. By the late medieval period, official church guidelines emphasized that possession should be diagnosed only when clear supernatural signs were present and that natural explanations should be exhausted first. This relatively cautious approach at the official level wasn't always reflected in popular belief or local practice, where fear of demons and attribution of unusual behavior to possession might be more common. The ritual of exorcism itself was carefully regulated by church authorities, with only authorized priests permitted to perform it and specific liturgical forms prescribed. The Roman ritual, standardized across the Western Church, included detailed procedures for exorcism that emphasized prayer, invocation of holy names, and commands to demons rather than violence or harsh treatment of the possessed person. The possessed individual was to be treated with compassion, as a victim of demonic attack rather than as a willing participant in evil, and the exorcist was instructed to distinguish carefully between the demon and the person, directing anger and forceful commands at the former while treating the latter gently. In practice, exorcisms might be more or less harsh depending on the priest involved and local circumstances, and accounts exist of possessed individuals being beaten, starved, or subjected to other harsh treatments in attempts to drive out demons, though these practices violated official church guidelines. The theology of demonic activity also included the concept of oppression or obsession, spiritual attacks that fell short of full possession, and these categories might be invoked to explain mental distress that seemed to have a spiritual dimension without the full signs of possession. A person experiencing severe depression with thoughts of despair and self-harm might be understood as suffering from demonic oppression rather than possession, attacked by evil spirits seeking to lead them to despair but not fully controlled by demons. This framework allowed for spiritual intervention through prayer, blessing, and sacraments without requiring the dramatic ritual of exorcism. The potential for spiritual causation meant that clergy were often involved in treating mental distress, whether through prayer, blessing, exorcism, or simply providing pastoral care. Monasteries and cathedral chapters often cared for people experiencing mental health crises, providing shelter, food, and spiritual comfort, even if they couldn't provide a cure. The monastic environment, with its structured routine of prayer, work, and rest, its emphasis on community life within clear rules, and its removal from the pressures and temptations of secular life, might actually have been therapeutic for some people experiencing mental health challenges. The stability and predictability of monastic life, the regular rhythm of the liturgical hours calling monks to prayer 7 times a day, the simplicity of monastic cells and diet, and the supportive community of fellow monks or nuns could provide a healing environment even without any specific medical or psychological intervention. Some monasteries developed particular expertise in caring for the mentally ill, maintaining infirmaries with separate facilities for those whose behavior was too disruptive for the general monastic community. Monastic records occasionally mention brothers or sisters who suffered from melancholia, madness, or other mental afflictions, and while we don't have detailed information about their care, the fact that they remained part of the community and were cared for rather than expelled suggests at least some level of compassion and acceptance. Religious houses also served as asylums in the original sense of that word, places of refuge for lay people experiencing mental health crises, with families sometimes paying for a troubled relative to stay in a monastery where they would receive care. The quality of this care varied enormously depending on the resources of the institution, the attitudes of its leadership, and the specific circumstances of the individual, but at minimum it usually meant shelter, food, and removal from circumstances that might be exacerbating their condition. Parish priests, as the clergy most directly engaged with ordinary lay people's daily lives, also played important roles in responding to mental health problems in their communities.
A good parish priest might serve as a counselor to parishioners struggling with grief, anxiety, despair, or other emotional distress, offering both spiritual guidance and practical advice.
The confessional provided a confidential space where people could unburden themselves of guilt, fear, and troubling thoughts, and while the priest's response was framed in terms of sin and penance, the psychological relief of confession and the receiving of absolution could be genuinely therapeutic. Priests also performed blessings and administered sacraments that were believed to provide spiritual protection and strength. And for a medieval person who believed in the reality and power of these spiritual interventions, they could offer real comfort and hope. Religious explanations could actually be a source of comfort, because if your suffering came from God, it might serve a divine purpose, whether as a trial to strengthen your faith, an opportunity to share in Christ's suffering, or a means of atoning for your sins or those of others. Some medieval mystics and saints experienced visions, ecstasies, and altered states that might be interpreted through a modern lens as symptoms of mental illness, but in their own time were often seen as signs of holiness and divine favor. The boundary between sanctity and madness was sometimes thin, and the same behaviors might be celebrated in one context and condemned in another, depending on the person's piety, social status, and whether their visions confirmed or challenged church doctrine. The medieval period produced numerous women mystics in particular, figures like Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, Catherine of Siena, and Margery Kempe, whose writings reveal intense spiritual experiences that included visions, auditory experiences, and altered states of consciousness. Modern scholars have debated whether some of these women might have been experiencing symptoms of mental illness, temporal lobe epilepsy, or other conditions, but such diagnostic retrofitting risks missing the point of how these women and their contemporaries understood their experiences. These mystics lived in a world where direct experience of the divine was possible and valued, where visions could convey important theological truths, and where intensity of religious feeling was seen as potentially bringing one closer to God. Their experiences were taken seriously by church authorities. Their writings were copied and circulated, and some of them became influential voices in both religious and political affairs. The validation of mystical experience provided a framework within which certain types of unusual mental experiences could be not just accepted but celebrated, though this framework was available primarily to those whose lives otherwise showed evidence of holiness and orthodoxy. For every mystic whose visions were validated, there were probably many more people experiencing unusual mental states who were dismissed as mad, heretical, or demonic rather than inspired. Folk beliefs and superstitions provided yet another layer of interpretation for mental health issues in medieval times, particularly among the common people who might have limited access to learned physicians or sophisticated theological discussions. These folk understandings often blended pre-Christian beliefs with Christian elements, creating a rich and sometimes contradictory tapestry of explanations for mental distress. The common people of medieval Europe lived in a world where magic, both beneficial and harmful, was understood to be real and operative. Wise women and cunning men, local healers who operated outside the official structures of church and university medicine, were consulted for all manner of problems, including mental distress. These folk healers worked with a combination of herbal knowledge passed down through generations, ritual practices that might have pre-Christian origins, Christian prayers and invocations, and simple common sense and psychology. A village healer treating someone for melancholia might prepare an herbal tonic while also performing a blessing,
advising the patient to avoid certain places or activities thought to attract bad influences, and simply spending time listening to the patient's troubles and offering encouragement.
The relationship between official and unofficial healing was complex, with church authorities sometimes condemning folk magic as superstition or even heresy, while common people, including many clergy, continued to use or at least tolerate such practices. The line between acceptable religious ritual and condemned magic was not always clear, and practices that looked very similar might be blessed by the church in one context and condemned in another. Pilgrimages to sacred wells, springs, and stones that likely had pre-Christian significance continued throughout the medieval period, with church authorities often choosing to Christianize these sites by associating them with saints rather than trying to suppress them entirely. Many of these sites were associated with healing, including healing of mental afflictions, and people would travel to them seeking relief, leaving offerings, drinking or bathing in holy water, and performing rituals that blended Christian prayer with older customs. Many medieval people believed in the evil eye, the notion that certain people could curse others with a glance, causing misfortune, illness, or madness. They believed in witchcraft, and while the great witch hunts were primarily a phenomenon of the early modern period rather than the Middle Ages proper, the belief that malevolent magic could cause harm was widespread throughout medieval times. A person whose behavior suddenly changed might be suspected of being cursed or bewitched, and folk healers known by various names, such as wise women, cunning folk, or charmers, might be consulted to break the spell. These healers used a combination of herbs, charms, prayers, and rituals, some clearly derived from Christian practice, and others with much older, possibly pre-Christian origins. Counter-magic, the practice of using magic to undo magical harm, was technically condemned by the church but widely practiced at the popular level. A person believed to be bewitched might be given amulets to wear, herbs to burn or carry, specific prayers to recite, or advised to perform certain actions to break the spell. Sometimes, the alleged witch would be confronted directly, as it was believed that forcing the witch to remove the curse or inflicting some harm on the witch would undo the magical damage. These beliefs could lead to accusations, conflicts, and violence within communities, particularly when misfortune struck and people looked for someone to blame. However, the witchcraft accusations in the medieval period were generally less systematic and less deadly than they would become in the 16th and 17th centuries, and many accusations were handled through local dispute resolution, compensation, or church penance rather than through execution. The reality that mental illness could strike anyone without obvious cause, that a person could change seemingly overnight from healthy to disturbed, was frightening in a world without scientific understanding of brain disorders, and attributing such changes to curses or witchcraft provided an explanation that, while incorrect, at least made the inexplicable seem potentially controllable through countermeasures. The moon was thought to have a powerful influence on the mind, giving us the words lunatic and lunacy from the Latin luna for moon, and people whose mental state seemed to fluctuate might be described as moonstruck or subject to lunar influence. Certain places were considered dangerous to mental health. Fairies and spirits were believed to inhabit liminal spaces like crossroads, springs, and ancient burial mounds, and encounters with these entities might drive a person mad or steal their wits away. Changelings. The belief that fairies might steal a human child and replace it with one of their own could be used to explain children who didn't develop normally, or who showed signs of what we might recognize as developmental disorders or mental illness. Similarly, elves were sometimes blamed for sudden illness or mental disturbance, giving us the term elf-struck for someone who seemed to have lost their reason suddenly. The concept of fairy abduction or interference offered an explanation for sudden personality changes or the onset of mental illness that was particularly applied to otherwise healthy individuals who abruptly began behaving strangely. It also reflected, perhaps, the distress of communities and families trying to understand why someone they knew well had become someone they no longer recognized. The changeling belief, while it could lead to tragic outcomes including neglect or abuse of children with disabilities, also represented an attempt to make sense of why a child might be radically different from expectations, and in some cases might have actually protected such children by explaining their difference as not their fault, but rather as the substitution of a fairy creature. Folk astronomy and astrology at the popular level also shaped understanding of mental health, with certain planetary configurations thought to predispose to madness, certain times of year considered more dangerous for mental stability, and birth under certain signs thought to influence mental temperament. While learned physicians might use sophisticated astrological calculations, common people had their own simpler versions of astrological belief that influenced when they would undertake important activities, when they would seek treatment, and how they understood their own temperaments and tendencies. Some plants were associated with madness, both as causes and cures. Henbane, belladonna, and mandrake were all known to cause delirium and hallucinations if consumed, while other herbs like St. John's wort were believed to protect against mental disturbance and evil spirits. Holy wells and sacred springs were pilgrimage sites where people sought healing for all manner of ailments, including mental afflictions, and the practice of leaving offerings at these sites and bathing in or drinking their waters represented a blend of Christian and much older religious practices. Saints were also important in folk healing, with particular saints associated with particular afflictions, and people suffering from mental distress might make pilgrimages to shrines dedicated to saints known for healing madness, or might wear amulets bearing a saint's image. Saint Dymphna became particularly associated with mental illness. Her legend told of an Irish princess who fled to Belgium to escape her father's inappropriate attention and was martyred there, and her shrine at Geel became a major pilgrimage site for those seeking relief from mental afflictions, eventually developing into what some historians consider an early model of community-based mental health care. The practice at Geel was remarkable and worth describing in detail, because it represented something genuinely innovative in medieval responses to mental illness. Pilgrims seeking Saint Dymphna's intercession for mental afflictions would travel to Geel and stay in the town while praying at the saint's shrine. As the shrine's reputation grew, more and more pilgrims arrived, staying for extended periods while seeking cure. The townspeople of Geel began taking pilgrims into their homes, caring for them as boarders while they continued their devotions. Over time, this practice became institutionalized, with families in Geel regularly housing people with mental illness, sometimes for months or years. These visitors, called boarders, lived as part of the household, participating in family life and work as they were able, while also continuing their prayers at the shrine. The system persisted beyond the medieval period and, in modified form, continues even today, making Geel perhaps the longest-running example of community integration of people with mental illness in Western history. What made the Geel system work was the combination of religious meaning, the belief that Saint Dymphna could heal and that proximity to her shrine was beneficial, economic incentive, families were paid for housing boarders, community acceptance, housing the mentally ill became part of Geel's identity and economy, and practical integration. Boarders were not simply confined but participated in ordinary life.
This model contrasts sharply with the institutional confinement that would dominate mental health care in later centuries, and suggests that medieval people were capable of more humane and sophisticated approaches to mental illness than is sometimes assumed. Based mental health care. These folk beliefs might seem irrational to modern eyes, but they served important functions in medieval society, providing explanations for frightening and inexplicable experiences, offering communities ways to respond to mental health crises, and giving those who suffered a framework for understanding their experiences that didn't necessarily involve condemnation or exile. The experience of mental illness in medieval times varied enormously depending on your social class, gender, where you lived, and the specific nature of your symptoms. But we can try to reconstruct what life might have been like for someone struggling with their mental health in this era. For many people, particularly those from lower social classes living in small rural communities, mental health issues would first be dealt with within the family. A person experiencing depression might be encouraged to work through it, since stopping work often meant starvation, and the rhythm of agricultural labor, dictated by seasons and necessity, didn't allow much room for rest. The agricultural year followed a relentless pattern: plowing in spring, planting, tending crops through summer, harvesting in fall, and preparing for winter, with each season bringing its own demanding tasks that required the labor of every able-bodied family member. Someone experiencing depression would be expected to continue participating in this work cycle as much as possible, and while this might seem harsh, the structured routine and physical labor might actually have been helpful for some people, providing purpose, preventing isolation, and using up some of the restless energy that can accompany depression and anxiety. The shame of being unable to fulfill one's role as worker and provider could worsen depression, creating a vicious cycle. But the absolute necessity of work also meant that many people didn't have the option of completely withdrawing, which might have prevented the extreme isolation that can deepen mental health crises. Families coping with a member's mental illness developed their own strategies based on practical necessity, observation of what seemed to help or harm, and advice from neighbors, healers, and clergy. These strategies might include adjusting the person's work assignments to tasks they could manage, ensuring they ate regularly even when appetite was poor, encouraging participation in community and religious activities, preventing access to means of self-harm, and simply maintaining patient presence and care during periods of acute distress. If someone's behavior became too disruptive or dangerous, families might physically restrain them, sometimes keeping them confined in a room or even chained to prevent them from harming themselves or others, or from wandering away. This sounds cruel to modern sensibilities, and it certainly could be. But it's important to understand that families often had few other options, and that restraint didn't necessarily mean abandonment. Family members might continue to care for their troubled relative, feeding them and attending to their basic needs even as they kept them confined. The decision to restrain a family member must have been agonizing in many cases, representing a failure of other interventions and an acknowledgement that the person had become a danger to themselves or others. Restraint took various forms depending on resources and circumstances. A wealthy family might have a room that could be locked, with servants assigned to care for the confined person, while a poor family might use rope or chains to tether someone to a bed or post, or might lock them in a shed or stable. The conditions of confinement varied from something approaching humane care to horrific neglect, and we should not romanticize or excuse the worst cases, but we should also recognize that medieval families faced impossible choices with inadequate resources and knowledge. Some families maintained care for mentally ill relatives for years or even decades at significant cost to their own well-being and resources, demonstrating devotion even if they couldn't provide effective treatment. Other families, overwhelmed by the burden or frightened by violent behavior, might abandon troubled relatives, turning them out to wander or leaving them at a monastery or hospital if one was accessible. The village community might also play a role in managing mental illness, sometimes tolerant and supportive, sometimes fearful and hostile. A village might collectively decide that someone's behavior had become too disruptive or dangerous and demand that the family confine them or remove them from the community. Alternatively, a village might rally around a family struggling with a mentally ill member, providing material support, helping with restraint when necessary, and accepting the person's presence even when their behavior was strange. The factors that determined whether a community responded with compassion or rejection included the person's behavior before becoming ill, the family's standing in the community, whether the behavior was merely odd or actually dangerous, and the community's resources and tolerance for difference. In some cases, communities might be surprisingly tolerant of what we'd call mental illness. A village might have its local eccentric or holy fool, someone whose behavior was odd but who was accepted as part of the community, and even occasionally valued for supposedly possessing special insight or prophetic gifts. The concept of the holy fool, or fool for Christ, had particular resonance in medieval Christianity, drawing on biblical passages about the wisdom of fools and the foolishness of worldly wisdom, and someone whose mental state set them apart from normal society might occasionally be reinterpreted through this religious lens. However, tolerance had its limits, and when someone's behavior became violent, persistently disruptive, or simply too burdensome for their family to manage, other solutions had to be found. The wandering mad, people with mental illness who either fled their homes or were turned out by families unable to care for them, were a recognized presence on medieval roads and in towns. These individuals, often begging for survival, were vulnerable to exploitation, violence, and the elements. Some might attach themselves to pilgrimage routes, mingling with legitimate pilgrims and receiving charity intended for travelers. Others might drift from town to town, sleeping rough and eating whatever they could beg or scavenge. Towns and cities, dealing with growing populations of poor and marginal people, developed various responses to the wandering mad. Some towns gave alms to help them move on to the next town, essentially passing the problem elsewhere. Some provided temporary shelter in hospitals or almshouses. Some attempted to distinguish between the deserving poor who were unable to work through no fault of their own and the undeserving poor who were seen as lazy or morally corrupt, with the mentally ill potentially falling into either category depending on local attitudes and specific circumstances. The harshest responses involved punishment or expulsion, treating the mentally ill as criminals or public nuisances rather than as sick people deserving care. In cities and larger towns, more institutional options began to develop over the course of the medieval period. Some monasteries and religious houses accepted people suffering from mental illness, caring for them alongside the physically sick and the poor. Hospitals, which in medieval times were primarily religious institutions focused on care rather than cure, sometimes included wards or separate facilities for those with mental afflictions. In London, the Hospital of St. Mary of Bethlehem, founded in the 13th century, began specializing in the care of the mentally ill by the 14th century, eventually giving us the word Bedlam as a corruption of Bethlehem and becoming synonymous with chaos and madness. However, we shouldn't imagine these institutions as therapeutic in any modern sense. They provided basic shelter and sustenance, and they removed disruptive individuals from the general population, but they offered little in the way of treatment, and conditions could be grim. The development of hospitals, specifically for the mentally ill, though rare in the medieval period, represented an acknowledgement that mental illness required specialized facilities distinct from general hospitals for the sick poor. These early psychiatric institutions varied widely in their approach and conditions, from relatively humane facilities that provided clean lodging, adequate food, and gentle restraint when necessary, to hellish dungeons where patients were chained in filth, inadequately fed, and subjected to harsh treatment. The staff of these institutions had no training in mental health care as we would understand it, and their primary functions were containment and basic physical maintenance rather than treatment or cure. Some institutions did attempt therapies based on humoral theory or religious practice, but others simply warehoused their patients. The experience of being institutionalized in a medieval mental health facility would have been profoundly dehumanizing in many cases, with loss of liberty, loss of privacy, loss of dignity, and loss of connection to family and community. For some patients, especially those from poor families unable to provide care, institutionalization might have at least meant regular meals and shelter, but it came at the cost of confinement, with others experiencing acute mental distress, possible mistreatment by staff, and the stigma of being labeled mad. Medieval people did understand that mixing different types of patients could be problematic, and some facilities attempted to separate the melancholic from the violently mad, or the recently arrived from the chronically ill. But resources rarely permitted the kind of careful classification and separation that might have made institutions more humane or therapeutic. Some municipal authorities began designating specific locations for holding people deemed mad, sometimes cells in gates or towers, sometimes separate buildings, and those confined in these places might be chained, left in darkness, and displayed to curious onlookers who paid to view the mad as a form of entertainment, a practice that continued well beyond the medieval period. For the wealthy, more options were available. Affluent families might keep a mentally ill relative at home attended by servants, or they might send them to stay in a monastery or hospital while paying for their care. Some wealthy individuals experiencing mental health crises might travel to healing shrines and spas, seeking cures through prayer, holy relics, or therapeutic baths. The experience was undeniably different for those who could afford to purchase better care and greater privacy, though wealth was no guarantee against the suffering itself or against the limited understanding of the era. A wealthy merchant experiencing depression might consult multiple physicians, try various treatments, make expensive pilgrimages, and still find no relief, but at least he would not face the added burden of destitution that made mental illness so much worse for the poor. Wealthy families could also afford to maintain privacy around a relative's mental illness, preventing the public shame and gossip that might accompany mental health problems in poorer, more public circumstances. They could pay for companions to stay with and supervise a troubled relative rather than resorting to physical restraint. They could provide better nutrition, more comfortable lodging, and access to books, music, and other diversions that might ease mental distress. However,
Wealth also brought its own pressures related to inheritance, marriage, and family reputation, and wealthy families might face difficult decisions about whether to acknowledge a member's mental illness, with potential consequences for arranged marriages, business partnerships, and social standing. Some wealthy individuals with mental illness were quietly managed within their families, their condition an open secret in their social circle, but not publicly acknowledged. Others might be sent away to distant monasteries or estates where they could be cared for out of sight. The management of mental illness among the wealthy involved not just medical and spiritual care, but also legal and financial considerations, particularly questions about whether someone was competent to manage their own affairs or needed a guardian appointed. The treatments available for mental health conditions in medieval times reflected the various explanatory frameworks we've discussed, ranging from interventions based on humoral theory to spiritual remedies to folk healing practices. For mental distress, understood as a humoral imbalance, particularly an excess of black bile causing melancholy, treatment focused on restoring balance through the non-naturals that Galen had identified. Diet was a primary intervention, with physicians prescribing foods thought to counteract the cold, dry qualities of black bile with warm, moist alternatives. A melancholic patient might be told to eat light, easily digestible foods, drink wine in moderation, and consume things like chicken, eggs, and white bread while avoiding dense, hard-to-digest foods like beef or lentils. The medical theory behind these dietary recommendations was elaborate, with each food classified according to its humoral qualities and its suitability for different temperaments and conditions. Bread made from refined wheat flour was considered light and nourishing, suitable for the melancholic, while heavy black bread might worsen the condition. Fresh fish was preferable to salted or dried. Fruits were viewed with some suspicion as potentially causing humoral imbalance, but certain fruits like figs or dates might be recommended in moderation. Sugar, expensive and available primarily to the wealthy, was considered warming and strengthening, potentially helpful for melancholia. Spices like ginger, cinnamon, and saffron were valued not just for flavor, but for their supposed warming properties and ability to stimulate the spirits. Wine, taken in moderation, was almost universally recommended as part of medieval medical treatment, considered to warm and strengthen the body and lift the spirits. The elderly and the melancholic were particularly advised to drink wine as medicine. However, excessive drinking was condemned both medically and morally, recognized as potentially worsening mental disturbance rather than helping it. Beer and ale, the common beverages for ordinary people who couldn't afford wine, were less highly regarded medically, but still considered preferable to water, which was often contaminated and unsafe to drink. The attention paid to diet in medieval medicine reflected a genuine understanding that nutrition affected overall health, including mental health, even if the specific theories about humoral properties were incorrect. Beyond diet, physicians might recommend changes in the patient's daily routine, including gentle exercise, music, pleasant conversation, and activities to distract from morbid thoughts. The prescription of pleasant environments and good company might seem obvious to us, but it represented a genuine understanding that mental state could be influenced by external factors. Medieval medical advice for melancholia often sounds remarkably modern in its emphasis on lifestyle factors. Get enough sleep, but not too much. Take moderate exercise in fresh air. Engage in enjoyable activities. Maintain social connections. Avoid dwelling on negative thoughts. And seek out beauty in nature and art. Physicians recognized that isolation worsened mental distress,
and recommended that melancholic patients surround themselves with cheerful companions, listen to music, observe beautiful landscapes or gardens, and engage in pleasant pastimes.
For the wealthy, this might mean organizing entertainments, bringing in musicians, taking trips to the countryside, or engaging in hunting and other aristocratic recreations. For those of more modest means, it might simply mean ensuring the person wasn't left alone too much, encouraging participation in community activities, and finding simple pleasures in daily life. The recommendation of music for treating mental distress has ancient roots and was taken seriously in medieval medicine, with different modes of music thought to have different effects on the humors and emotions. Gentle, harmonious music was prescribed for melancholia, while livelier music might be recommended for those sunk in lethargy. The therapeutic use of music reflected an understanding that sound and rhythm could directly affect emotional state, an insight that modern music therapy validates. Reading, for those who were literate, might be recommended, with light, entertaining material preferred over heavy theological or philosophical texts that might burden an already troubled mind. Physical activity was also prescribed, but with careful attention to finding the right type and amount for each individual. Gentle walks in pleasant surroundings, gardening, hunting for the nobility, simple crafts or handiwork, all were recognized as potentially helpful for lifting spirits and providing distraction from troubling thoughts. However, excessive or exhausting physical labor was thought potentially harmful, especially for melancholics already characterized by coldness and dryness, who might be further weakened by too much exertion. When dietary and lifestyle changes proved insufficient, more aggressive interventions might be employed. Bloodletting was a common treatment for many medieval ailments, based on the idea that removing excess blood would help restore humoral balance, and it was sometimes used for mental distress as well, though it likely did more harm than good in most cases. Purging and inducing vomiting were other methods of removing excess or corrupted humors from the body. Herbal medicines were widely used, and medieval herbals, books that cataloged plants and their medical uses, included remedies for mental afflictions. Opium poppies could provide pain relief and sedation, helpful perhaps for someone in acute distress. Valerian root, still used today for anxiety and sleep problems, was known to medieval herbalists. John's wort, now recognized as having some effectiveness for mild depression, was used in medieval times as well. Henbane, mandrake, and other potentially toxic plants might be used in carefully measured doses for their sedative or mind-altering properties, though the line between medicine and poison was thin. The pharmacopoeia available to medieval healers was actually quite extensive, drawing on classical Mediterranean herbs, plants native to Northern Europe, and exotic imports brought by trade from Asia and Africa. Saffron, expensive and imported from the East, was valued for treating melancholia. Amber, ground into powder, was used for various mental complaints. Musk and other animal-derived substances were employed in complex preparations. Medieval pharmacy involved not just knowing which plants to use, but how to prepare them through infusions, decoctions, distillations, or incorporation into pills, powders, syrups, or ointments. The compounding of medicines was a skilled craft, and apothecaries in larger towns specialized in preparing and selling medicinal preparations. The medicines were often complex recipes involving dozens of ingredients,
each supposedly contributing to the overall therapeutic effect through its particular humoral properties. While many of these elaborate compound medicines had little real efficacy beyond placebo effect, the practice of individualized prescription and careful compounding showed respect for the patient and for the medical art. Some simpler herbal preparations did contain compounds that modern research recognizes as having genuine psychological effects, though medieval healers didn't understand the mechanisms by which they worked.
The ritual of taking medicine, prescribed by an authority figure and prepared with care, also contributed psychological benefit through engaging the placebo response and providing hope for relief.
Bathing was considered therapeutic, with different types of baths prescribed for different conditions, and mineral baths at natural springs were particularly valued. Sleep was recognized as important for mental health, and various herbal preparations might be used to help someone sleep if insomnia was part of their affliction. For conditions understood as spiritual in nature, religious interventions were primary. Prayer was always appropriate, both by the sufferer and on their behalf by clergy and community. Confession and penance might be recommended to address any sins that could be contributing to spiritual distress. Pilgrimage to holy sites, particularly shrines associated with healing, was a common response to serious illness, including mental illness. The journey itself, which might take weeks or months, provided a focused purpose and hope for relief, while the arrival at the shrine offered the possibility of miraculous healing through the intercession of saints or contact with holy relics. The practice of pilgrimage for mental health deserves more attention because it was such a central part of medieval responses to serious afflictions of all kinds. Pilgrimage involved multiple elements that could be therapeutic, even apart from any miraculous cure. The decision to undertake pilgrimage represented a commitment to seeking healing and taking action against illness, breaking the passivity that can deepen depression. The physical journey involved exercise, fresh air, changing scenery, and new experiences, all of which could benefit mental state. The focused purpose of traveling to a specific goal provided structure and meaning during what might otherwise feel like meaningless suffering. Meeting other pilgrims created social connection and the sharing of stories, allowing people to realize they weren't alone in their suffering. The arrival at the shrine provided a moment of intense hope and emotional release, whether or not actual miraculous healing occurred. The religious framework of pilgrimage allowed people to understand their suffering within a meaningful narrative about sin, redemption, trial, and divine mercy. Major pilgrimage sites like Santiago de Compostela, Rome, Jerusalem, or Canterbury attracted thousands of pilgrims annually, including many seeking healing from physical and mental ailments. Smaller regional shrines served local populations, and most areas had multiple sites associated with particular saints or particular types of healing. The infrastructure of pilgrimage, including roads, bridges, hospitality facilities, and guidebooks, represented a significant investment of medieval resources in facilitating these healing journeys. While we cannot know how many pilgrims actually experienced lasting relief from mental health problems, the practice persisted throughout the medieval period and beyond, suggesting that at least some people found benefit in it. Exorcism was the specific remedy for cases believed to involve demonic possession, and while it's often portrayed in sensational terms, medieval exorcism rituals, at least as prescribed in official church documents, were relatively restrained ceremonies involving prayer, invocation of divine names, holy water, and commands for the demon to depart.
Blessings and holy objects like crosses, blessed metals, or relics might be given to someone suffering from mental affliction to protect them from evil influences. The practice of sleeping in churches or near saints' tombs, called incubation, was sometimes used, with the hope that the saint might appear in a healing dream. Folk healing practices added yet more options to this therapeutic arsenal. Charms and amulets might be created to ward off evil influences or break curses. Ritual cleansings could involve washing with specific herbs or at sacred wells. Some practices seemed to blend punishment with cure, such as beating someone to drive out evil spirits, which we should recognize as a form of abuse regardless of its supposed therapeutic intent. Others were gentler, involving singing, music, or storytelling as means of soothing troubled minds. Occasionally, we find evidence of what we might recognize as early forms of talk therapy, with religious counselors or healers spending time listening to troubled individuals and offering advice or comfort. Looking more closely at specific mental health conditions as we understand them today, we can try to trace what medieval experience might have been like for people suffering from depression, anxiety disorders, psychotic disorders, and other forms of mental distress. Depression, experienced as persistent sadness, loss of pleasure in activities, changes in sleep and appetite, and feelings of worthlessness or guilt would most likely have been understood through the lens of melancholia in the medieval period. The symptoms medieval physicians associated with melancholia overlap significantly with modern depression: prolonged sadness, fears and anxieties, desire for isolation, disturbed sleep, and thoughts of death. Interestingly, melancholia occupied an ambiguous cultural space. It was an illness, certainly, and one that could be severely debilitating. But it was also sometimes associated with scholarly and artistic temperaments, perhaps because the introspection and sensitivity that might contribute to depression were valued in certain contexts. Some degree of melancholic temperament was almost expected in scholars, philosophers, and poets, though the line between productive melancholy and dangerous depression was recognized even if not clearly defined. Religious melancholy, a specific type of depression centered on fears about salvation, damnation, and one's relationship with God, was taken seriously by medieval religious authorities who recognized that such spiritual despair could lead to the ultimate rejection of hope. For a medieval person experiencing what we'd call major depression, daily life would become increasingly difficult. The labor-intensive nature of medieval life meant that the fatigue and lack of motivation characteristic of depression could have severe practical consequences. Inability to work meant inability to eat, and the social support systems that existed, primarily family and church, depended on maintaining relationships that depression made difficult. Someone sinking into depression might withdraw from community life, stop attending church, neglect their appearance and responsibilities, and this withdrawal could be interpreted as laziness, sin, or the influence of demons rather than illness, though compassionate observers might recognize it as melancholia requiring treatment. The remedies we discussed earlier, dietary changes, herbal medicines, pleasant company, music, would be attempted, and for some people, these might have provided real relief, even if the underlying neurobiology wasn't understood. Anxiety, with its symptoms of persistent worry, physical tension, rapid heartbeat, and catastrophic thinking, would have been understood partly through humoral theory, perhaps as an imbalance causing excessive heat, or as a spiritual affliction. The term anxiety itself comes from Latin and was used in medieval medical texts, though the concept wasn't as fully developed as modern anxiety disorders. Phobias and obsessions were recognized,
with various terms used to describe irrational fears or compulsive thoughts. Someone suffering from what we'd call generalized anxiety disorder might be described as fearful, worried, or having an excess of care. The physical symptoms of anxiety, rapid heartbeat, sweating, trembling, stomach problems, would be recognized but might be attributed to humoral imbalance or organ dysfunction. For a medieval person living with chronic anxiety, the uncertain and dangerous nature of medieval life might paradoxically make some anxieties seem more reasonable. Worrying about starvation, disease, or violence wasn't necessarily irrational when these were real and present dangers. However, anxiety that was clearly excessive, focused on unlikely dangers, or paralyzing in its intensity would be recognized as problematic. Religious anxiety about sin and salvation was particularly common, and spiritual counselors developed considerable expertise in addressing what they called scrupulosity, the obsessive fear of having committed sins or of being in a state of damnation. The advice given by medieval spiritual directors for scrupulosity sometimes sounds remarkably similar to modern cognitive behavioral therapy, encouraging the sufferer to question their catastrophic thoughts, to trust in God's mercy rather than dwelling on fears, and to focus on actions rather than endless rumination. Herbal remedies with sedative or calming properties might be used to ease the physical symptoms of anxiety, and practices like prayer, meditation, and contemplation could serve functions similar to modern mindfulness techniques, even if the underlying theory was different. Psychotic disorders, conditions we would now diagnose as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder with psychotic features, or brief psychotic episodes, presented medieval people with some of the most challenging and frightening manifestations of mental illness. Someone experiencing hallucinations, hearing voices, seeing visions, or holding delusional beliefs departed so dramatically from shared reality that they seemed to inhabit a different world entirely. The medieval response to psychosis was complex and varied. Visions and voices weren't automatically pathologized. After all, legitimate religious visions were an accepted part of Christian tradition, with biblical prophets, saints, and mystics all experiencing direct communication with the divine. The challenge was distinguishing between genuine spiritual experiences and pathological delusions, and medieval authorities proposed various criteria. Genuine visions should lead the person toward greater holiness, should align with church teaching, should be accompanied by humility rather than pride, and should produce good fruit in the person's life and community. Delusions and hallucinations that violated these criteria, that led to violence, blasphemy, or behavior contrary to Christian morality, would be interpreted as either illness or demonic influence. Someone experiencing acute psychosis, particularly if their behavior became violent or extremely bizarre, might be physically restrained for their own safety and that of others. They might be taken to a monastery or hospital for care, or, in the worst cases, locked away in whatever facilities existed for containing those deemed mad. The experience would be terrifying, both for the person losing touch with reality and for those around them who lacked the understanding and tools to help effectively. Some people experiencing psychotic episodes might wander, becoming part of the floating population of beggars, pilgrims, and displaced persons that moved through medieval Europe. Others might be cared for by their families or communities if their symptoms weren't too severe or if they had periods of lucidity between episodes. The association between madness and demonic possession was strongest with psychotic symptoms, particularly when someone exhibited radical personality changes, spoke in strange ways, or demonstrated behavior that seemed utterly foreign to their normal character.
Exorcism might be attempted in such cases, and while it wouldn't cure the underlying condition, the ritual itself, with its structure, authority, and promise of relief, might have provided some psychological benefit in cases where symptoms had a psychological rather than neurological origin, or during a natural remission of symptoms that might be attributed to the exorcism's success. Post-traumatic stress, which we now recognize as a mental health condition that can follow exposure to severe trauma, wasn't understood as a specific disorder in medieval times, but the symptoms would certainly have been observed. Medieval people regularly experienced potentially traumatic events. Warfare, violence, sudden death of loved ones, plague outbreaks, and other catastrophes were part of the fabric of medieval life. Soldiers returning from war might display what we'd recognize as symptoms of PTSD: nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and difficulty readjusting to peaceful life. These symptoms might be understood as a natural response to terrible experiences rather than as an illness requiring treatment, or they might be interpreted through religious frameworks, perhaps as spiritual wounding that required confession and penance. Women who survived traumatic childbirth, which was extremely dangerous in medieval times, might experience symptoms we'd recognize as postpartum PTSD, along with postpartum depression. Survivors of plague outbreaks, who watched family and neighbors die in agony while wondering if they'd be next, likely experienced trauma that would leave lasting psychological marks. Childhood trauma from abuse or witnessing violence would affect medieval children just as it does children today, though it might not be recognized or addressed as such. The medieval emphasis on stoicism, on enduring suffering patiently, and on accepting hardship as part of God's plan might have discouraged open discussion of psychological trauma, but we shouldn't assume that medieval people simply felt less or suffered less from traumatic experiences. The resilience factors that help people cope with trauma, social support, meaningful narratives to make sense of suffering, spiritual or philosophical frameworks, and practical coping mechanisms were available in medieval society even if formal trauma therapy was not. Cognitive and developmental disabilities, conditions we might diagnose today as intellectual disabilities, autism spectrum disorders, or other developmental differences, were recognized in medieval times, though understood very differently. Terms like natural fool or innocent were sometimes used for people born with cognitive disabilities, distinguishing them from those who lost their reason later in life. Canon law, the legal system of the Church, recognized that people with severe cognitive disabilities couldn't be held fully accountable for their actions and couldn't consent to contracts or marriage. Civil law varied by region but often included similar provisions. This legal recognition, while limited, suggests at least some understanding that intellectual disability was a condition people were born with rather than a moral failing. The experience of someone with a developmental disability in medieval times would depend enormously on their family's resources and their community's attitudes. In the best cases, they might be cared for by their family, given simple tasks they could manage, and protected within their community. In the worst cases, they might be neglected, abused, or turned out to survive as beggars. The changeling belief we mentioned earlier could lead to tragic outcomes. When a child didn't develop normally, believing they were a fairy changeling rather than a human child might lead to abandonment or worse. However, Christianity's emphasis on caring for the vulnerable and seeing Christ in the suffering could also motivate compassion. Monasteries sometimes cared for people with disabilities, both children and adults, providing shelter and basic care. Some saints' lives include stories of caring for people with cognitive disabilities as examples of Christian charity. People with milder cognitive disabilities, or what we might now recognize as autism, might find niches in medieval society where their differences were accommodated. The structured, repetitive nature of many medieval jobs, from agricultural labor to craft work to religious observance, might have suited some people whose cognitive styles differed from the norm. The rich symbolic and ritualistic life of medieval Christianity might have held appeal for some who thought in concrete or pattern-based ways.
The intersection of gender and mental health in medieval times reveals important differences in how men's and women's psychological suffering was understood and treated.
Women's mental health was often understood through the lens of their reproductive biology, a framework that traces back to ancient Greek medicine but remained influential throughout the medieval period. The uterus was considered a powerful organ that could affect a woman's entire physical and mental state. Hysteria, from the Greek word for uterus, was believed to be a specifically female affliction caused by a wandering womb that moved around the body, causing various symptoms, including mental disturbance. Though by the medieval period, the wandering womb theory was being questioned by more sophisticated medical authorities. Menstruation was thought to affect women's mental state, with the monthly cycle influencing the balance of humors. Pregnancy, childbirth, and the postpartum period were recognized as times of particular vulnerability for women's mental health, and medieval medical texts include descriptions of symptoms we'd recognize as postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis, sometimes attributed to corrupted breast milk or blood rising to affect the brain. Women were generally considered more susceptible to mental and emotional disturbance than men, seen as having weaker reason and stronger passions, a bias rooted in both ancient medicine and Christian theology's interpretation of women's nature. This gendered understanding meant that women's mental health issues might be taken less seriously, dismissed as female weakness or emotional excess, but it could also mean that some allowance was made for women's psychological struggles, particularly around childbirth. Religious life offered women one alternative to conventional social roles, and convents housed many women whose choices or circumstances set them apart from normal medieval life, some of whom may have been dealing with mental health issues. Female mystics, who experienced visions and altered states, occupied a complex position. Their experiences might be validated as genuine spiritual gifts, or they might be treated with suspicion, and the line between celebrated saint and suspected witch could be thin. Women accused of witchcraft, particularly in the later medieval period and beyond, sometimes displayed behaviors that modern clinicians might recognize as symptoms of mental illness, though we must be very careful not to reduce the historical persecution of women as witches to a mental health issue, as this ignores the social, economic, and misogynistic factors that primarily drove witch accusations. For men, mental health issues might be somewhat more likely to be taken seriously as genuine medical problems rather than emotional excess, but men also faced pressures that could affect their mental health, particularly warriors, who were expected to display courage and endurance. The chivalric code, with its emphasis on honor, prowess, and service, created pressures on aristocratic men that might contribute to anxiety or despair when they felt unable to live up to these ideals. Male clergy faced their own psychological pressures, including celibacy requirements, the weight of spiritual responsibility, and in some cases, the rigors of ascetic practice that could tax mental health. As the medieval period progressed, particularly in its later centuries, we can observe gradual changes in attitudes toward mental health and the development of somewhat more sophisticated approaches to care. Universities, which began to develop in the 11th and 12th centuries, created spaces for more systematic study of medicine and natural philosophy. Medical faculties translated and debated classical texts, gradually building a more organized body of medical knowledge. Some physicians began to question aspects of traditional humoral theory, or at least to refine and complicate it. The rediscovery of Aristotle's works and their integration into Christian theology by scholars like Thomas Aquinas created space for more naturalistic explanations of mental phenomena alongside theological ones. There was a growing recognition that mental illness deserved specialized care rather than simply being lumped together with other forms of sickness or poverty. The development of urban hospitals and charitable institutions in larger cities created more options for care, though we shouldn't overestimate the quality of this care by modern standards. Some cities began to make more systematic provisions for people deemed insane, designating specific facilities or appointing guardians to manage their affairs. Legal concepts around mental capacity became more developed, with more nuanced distinctions between different degrees and types of mental impairment. Trade guilds and confraternities, the social organizations that structured much of urban life, sometimes made provisions for members who became mentally ill, offering financial support or care. The growth of pilgrimage sites and cults associated with healing mental illness created networks of hope and help, even if the help was more spiritual than medical. Books of remedies and health advice began to circulate more widely, including sections on mental health, bringing some medical knowledge beyond the small circle of learned physicians. None of these changes represented a revolution in understanding or treatment, and they affected only a minority of the population, primarily urban dwellers with some resources, but they suggest a gradually increasing recognition that mental illness was a significant problem, deserving specific attention and response. Regional variations across medieval Europe also affected how mental health was understood and treated, as medical traditions, religious practices, legal systems, and cultural attitudes varied significantly across different regions. In the Islamic world, which preserved and advanced classical learning while much of Western Europe struggled through its early medieval period, mental illness was studied more systematically, with physicians like Avicenna writing detailed descriptions of mental disorders and their treatments. When these texts were translated into Latin in the 11th and 12th centuries, they enriched European medical knowledge. In the Byzantine Empire, the continuation of Roman legal and medical traditions meant somewhat more sophisticated approaches to mental illness were maintained even during Western Europe's darkest centuries. In Italy, particularly in cities with strong connections to Byzantine and Islamic learning, medical approaches to mental illness tended to be more developed than in Northern Europe. Spain, where Christian, Islamic, and Jewish cultures coexisted and exchanged ideas despite frequent conflicts, became an important center for medical translation and learning. Hospitals in the Islamic world sometimes included specific facilities for the mentally ill, and some of these ideas may have influenced European practice. In Scandinavia, where Christianity arrived later and pre-Christian beliefs remained influential longer, folk explanations for mental illness involving elves, trolls, and nature spirits remained particularly strong. In Celtic regions like Ireland, Wales, and Brittany, pre-Christian healing traditions blended with Christianity in distinctive ways, with holy wells and sacred sites maintaining their importance for healing into and beyond the medieval period. The Shrine of Saint.
Dimphna at Giel in present-day Belgium developed a unique model of care where pilgrims seeking healing from mental afflictions would stay in the homes of local townspeople, creating what some historians consider an early form of community-based mental health care that anticipated modern approaches by centuries.
In England, the common law gradually developed concepts around mental capacity and guardianship that would influence legal approaches to mental illness for centuries.
In German-speaking regions, local customs and civic ordinances varied widely from town to town in their provisions for the mentally ill.
Southern Europe's warmer climate and different agricultural patterns created different rhythms of life that might affect mental health and its treatment differently than in the harsher climates of Northern Europe.
Port cities with their diverse populations and exposure to different cultures might have somewhat more varied approaches to mental illness than isolated rural areas. Frontier regions, whether the contested borders between Christian and Muslim Spain, the shifting boundaries of Eastern Europe, or the wild frontiers of Scandinavia, might be both more dangerous for those with mental illness, who could easily become victims of violence or exploitation, and potentially more accepting of difference, since frontier societies often attracted people who didn't fit conventional social patterns.
The daily lived experience of mental illness in medieval times, when we try to imagine it in concrete terms, must have been profoundly isolating in many cases.
Consider a young woman in a small village who begins to experience what we would recognize as schizophrenia in her late teens.
At first, her family might notice that she seems distracted, that she withdraws from her friends and neglects her work. As voices begin to speak to her, voices no one else can hear, she might tell her mother about them, and her mother might be frightened, wondering if her daughter is possessed by demons or has been cursed. The local priest is called to pray over her and bless her with holy water. When this doesn't stop the voices, when the young woman begins to respond to them, speaking to invisible presences, when her behavior becomes increasingly strange and her grasp on shared reality loosens, the family faces an impossible choice. They cannot afford to travel to a distant shrine or hospital. They cannot afford to keep someone who has become unable to work. If she becomes violent or her behavior too disruptive, the village might demand she be restrained or removed. Her father might chain her in a shed or stable, bringing her food and checking on her, but keeping her separated from the community that no longer knows how to relate to her. She might spend years this way, in a twilight existence between care and captivity, while her parents grow old, wondering what they did to deserve this affliction, and whether their daughter is being punished for some sin. Or consider a successful merchant in a medieval city who develops what we'd call major depression. At first, he might try to push through it, but the characteristic symptoms, the crushing fatigue, the inability to take pleasure in anything, the rumination on themes of worthlessness and death gradually make it impossible for him to conduct his business. He begins missing meetings, neglecting his accounts, staying in bed when he should be at the market. His wife is confused and then angry, seeing his behavior as laziness or withdrawal of affection. His business partners become suspicious, wondering if he's cheating them or has secret vices. His priest suspects spiritual pride or hidden sin and urges more rigorous penance. The merchant tries to explain that he feels as if a heavy weight crushes his chest, that the world has become gray and meaningless, but his explanations are met with exhortations to pray harder, to count his blessings, to stop being selfish. A physician is eventually consulted, diagnoses an excess of black bile, and prescribes bloodletting and a change of diet. The treatments don't help, or help only marginally, and the merchant slowly loses his business, his reputation, and his standing in the community, all while fighting an invisible illness that his world barely has language to describe and certainly cannot effectively treat. Or imagine a veteran knight, a man who has fought in crusades and regional wars, who returns home after years of campaign to find that he cannot escape the memories of violence. He cannot sleep without nightmares. Sudden noises make him reach for weapons that aren't there. He feels disconnected from his family, unable to explain what he's experienced, unable to feel the emotions that once came naturally. He drinks heavily to numb the memories, which leads to angry outbursts that frighten his wife and children. His peers see him as damaged, unreliable, no longer fit for command. He might be encouraged to make pilgrimage, to confess his sins of war, to seek absolution for the blood on his hands. But the problem isn't guilt over what he's done, though that may be part of it, but rather the trauma that has rewired his nervous system in ways his world cannot comprehend. If he's fortunate, time and distance from combat may slowly heal him, the human capacity for resilience working its effects even without therapeutic intervention. If he's not fortunate, he might end his own life, an act that would condemn his soul according to church teaching, but that might seem like the only escape from unbearable suffering. Consider a child born with what we'd recognize as severe autism, nonverbal, and with intense sensory sensitivities. In a wealthy household, this child might be cared for by servants, kept in quiet rooms away from the overwhelming stimulation of medieval life, perhaps loved by parents who don't understand their child's condition but do their best to provide comfort. In a peasant household, with barely enough resources to feed the children who can work, this child's survival is much less certain. The changeling belief might take hold, with neighbors suggesting this cannot be the real child, that the fairies must have made a switch. The parents might be encouraged to try to force the changeling to reveal itself or leave, methods that could amount to neglect or worse. Or the child might simply be left at a monastery, abandoned to the charity of monks who might provide basic care if resources permit. These imagined, but historically grounded scenarios help us understand that mental illness in medieval times wasn't just an abstract matter of theories and treatments, but a lived reality for countless individuals who suffered, often without relief, and often without anyone truly understanding what they were experiencing. The medieval person with mental illness faced not just the symptoms of their condition, but also the limitations of medical knowledge, the potential for religious judgment, the economic pressures of a society with no safety net, the social isolation that could result from bizarre or disruptive behavior, and the very real physical dangers of restraint, confinement, or simply being vulnerable in a violent world. Yet, we should not paint an entirely dark picture, because alongside the ignorance and cruelty, there was also compassion. Families who could have abandoned troubled relatives, but instead cared for them for years. Monks and nuns who saw caring for the sick, including the mentally sick, as holy work. Communities that found ways to accommodate their local eccentrics. Physicians who genuinely tried to help, even with inadequate tools. Spiritual counselors who provided comfort, even when they couldn't provide cure. The medieval response to mental illness was a complex mixture of the best and worst of human nature, much like our own time's response, if we're honest. though we have the advantage of better understanding and more effective treatments. The relationship between creativity, spirituality, and mental illness in the medieval period deserves particular attention because the boundary between mystical experience and mental disturbance was genuinely blurry in ways that reveal much about medieval attitudes. The medieval Catholic Church validated and even celebrated certain types of extraordinary mental experiences, visions of heaven and things beyond, auditory experiences of divine voices, ecstatic states during prayer, and feelings of union with the divine were all part of accepted spiritual practice. Many canonized saints reported experiences that, if described by someone today in a secular context, would likely be classified as symptoms of mental illness: prolonged fasting leading to altered consciousness, self-flagellation producing altered states, visions and locutions, or interior voices, periods of spiritual darkness that sound remarkably like clinical depression, and ecstatic experiences that involved loss of normal consciousness and control. The question naturally arises, were medieval mystics mentally ill? This question, while natural from a modern perspective, may be somewhat misguided, because it assumes that mystical experience and mental illness are mutually exclusive categories, when in fact they might sometimes overlap. A person might genuinely have both a rich spiritual life and a mental health condition, and disentangling the two might be impossible even in principle. What matters more for understanding the medieval period is that a framework existed within which certain extraordinary mental experiences could be interpreted positively and integrated into a meaningful life narrative rather than purely pathologized. A person hearing voices might become a prophet rather than simply a lunatic if the voices were deemed to come from God rather than demons or disease. Someone whose mood swung between profound spiritual darkness and ecstatic joy might be understood as experiencing the trials and consolations common to the mystical path, rather than having bipolar disorder. The intense introspection and social withdrawal of the hermit or anchorite, which might look like severe depression in another context, could be reframed as holy solitude and contemplation. This reframing could be either helpful or harmful, depending on the situation. It might give meaning and dignity to experiences that would otherwise be merely painful, or it might prevent someone from seeking and receiving help they needed for a genuine medical condition. The Church did recognize that not all unusual experiences were divine, and spiritual directors were trained to help distinguish genuine mystical experience from delusion, demonic influence, or mental illness. The criteria used included whether the experiences led to greater humility and love, whether they aligned with Christian doctrine, whether the person's overall life showed fruits of holiness, and whether the person maintained reasonable control and judgment. These weren't foolproof methods, and there were certainly cases where mental illness was mistaken for sanctity and vice versa, but they represented a serious attempt to navigate genuinely difficult questions about the nature of unusual mental experiences. Art and literature from the medieval period, while not focused on psychological interiority in the way modern works often are, nevertheless offer glimpses into medieval understanding and experience of mental distress. Medical manuscripts included illustrations of melancholic individuals, often showing them in postures of despair, head in hands, surrounded by the scholarly tools that were associated with melancholic temperament. Literary works sometimes featured characters who went mad, often as a result of grief or love, providing culturally accepted narratives for understanding how mental breakdown could occur. The story of mad lovers who lost their reason from unfulfilled passion appeared in various forms, suggesting recognition that extreme emotional states could tip over into madness. Epic poems and romances sometimes featured warriors who went mad after terrible experiences in battle, stories that acknowledged, even if they didn't fully understand, the psychological impact of trauma. Saints' lives included accounts of holy people who cared for the mentally afflicted, or who themselves experienced spiritual trials that resembled mental illness. Marginal illustrations in manuscripts, those strange and sometimes disturbing images in the borders of medieval books, occasionally depicted madness or disturbed states in visual form. Mystery plays and religious dramas, performed for ordinary people who might not be able to read, sometimes included portrayals of possessed or mad individuals, shaping popular understanding of what mental disturbance looked like. Proverbs and folk sayings preserved popular wisdom about mental health, suggesting that excessive grief could lead to madness, that some people were born with weak reason, that the moon influenced mental state, and that certain life events like childbirth or terrible shock could unhinge the mind. Bestiaries, those medieval books about animals that mixed natural observation with moral allegory, sometimes included animals associated with madness or melancholy. The hare was associated with timidity and melancholy, the bat with darkness and night terrors. Even architectural features sometimes reflected concerns about mental health. Some churches included carvings of figures with exaggerated expressions of distress, anguish, or madness, perhaps representing demons or damned souls, but also capturing something of the human experience of psychological suffering. The economic dimensions of mental illness in medieval times are crucial to understanding the full picture, because the medieval economy offered virtually no safety net, and mental illness often meant inability to work. In a subsistence economy, where most people lived close to the margin of survival, the loss of a working family member to mental illness could push an entire household toward destitution. A farmer who could no longer work the fields, a craftsman who could no longer practice his trade, a merchant who could no longer manage business affairs, all faced economic collapse that would drag down their dependents as well. This economic pressure meant that families had powerful incentives to try to keep mentally ill relatives functioning as long as possible, and to seek cures or remedies that might restore their capacity to contribute economically. It also meant that families faced agonizing decisions when someone's mental illness made them unable to work but still required care and resources. The obligation to care for family members, strong in medieval society, came into conflict with the practical reality that resources were limited, and sometimes a choice had to be made between caring for someone who could not recover and ensuring the survival of those who could work and contribute. Wealthier families had more options. They could afford to maintain an unproductive relative, to pay for treatments and pilgrimages, to hire servants to provide care. But even wealth couldn't buy effective treatment for most mental illnesses with medieval medical knowledge. For the poor, mental illness combined with economic catastrophe often led to a descent into begging and vagrancy, and the roads of medieval Europe carried a floating population of the dispossessed that included many with mental health problems. Some cities began to make provisions for the care of the poor, including the mentally ill poor, through hospitals and charitable institutions funded by wealthy donors seeking to perform works of mercy, but these institutions could serve only a fraction of those in need. The question of legal competency also had major economic implications. If someone became mentally unable to manage their affairs, who controlled their property? Who made decisions about their business? Who guarded their interests? Various legal systems developed different answers to these questions, generally involving the appointment of guardians, but the potential for exploitation was always present, with unscrupulous relatives or others potentially taking advantage of someone's mental incapacity to seize their property or resources. For those without property, the question was different but equally pressing. Who bore the responsibility for their care, and how would that care be funded? Communities, religious institutions, and families all played roles, but the distribution of responsibility was often unclear and contested, and many mentally ill individuals likely fell through whatever gaps existed in these inadequate systems.
As we move toward wrapping up our long exploration of mental health in medieval times, it's worth reflecting on what this history can teach us about our own time and our own approaches to mental health.
On one hand, we've made extraordinary progress. We understand that mental illnesses are medical conditions with biological bases rather than moral failings or demonic possession. We have effective treatments for many conditions that would have been untreatable in medieval times. We have a much more extensive social safety net that prevents the complete destitution that medieval people with mental illness often faced. We have concepts like human rights and dignity that protect vulnerable people from some of the worst abuses that occurred in the past. And we have begun to reduce the stigma around mental illness, though this work remains far from complete. Looking back at medieval responses to mental health can give us a proper appreciation for how far we've come and how fortunate we are to live in a time of greater understanding. On the other hand, some medieval insights remain valuable, and some medieval failures mirror our own continuing struggles. The medieval recognition that mental health could be affected by diet, sleep, exercise, environment, and social connection, even if the explanatory framework of humoral theory was wrong, identified factors we now know are genuinely important. The medieval emphasis on community care and family involvement, while it could be oppressive, also reflected an understanding that isolated individuals suffer more than those embedded in networks of care and relationship. The medieval integration of mental health with spiritual and existential questions recognized that humans need meaning and purpose as well as properly balanced neurotransmitters, and that questions about suffering, mortality, and what makes life worth living cannot be reduced to mere symptoms to be medicated away. Medieval people at their best recognized that those suffering from mental afflictions deserved compassion and care, a lesson that still needs to be learned by too many people today. At the same time, medieval failures to adequately address mental illness, the tendency to blame sufferers for their condition, the inadequate resources devoted to care, the use of restraint and confinement as solutions, the social exclusion and economic abandonment of those with mental illness, all have echoes in our contemporary failures, our insufficient mental health services, our tendency to criminalize or marginalize the mentally ill, our difficulties in balancing autonomy with need for care, and our ongoing struggles to integrate people with mental health conditions fully into society. The medieval period also reminds us that every era must work with the knowledge and resources it has, and that future generations will likely look back on our current approaches to mental health with the same mixture of appreciation for our genuine efforts and horror at our limitations and blind spots that we feel looking back at medieval approaches. The medieval physician, doing bloodletting for melancholia, was trying to help based on the best understanding available, just as modern practitioners apply treatments that may someday be seen as crude or misguided. The medieval family restraining a violent or suicidal relative was facing an impossible situation with inadequate options, just as families today sometimes face impossible choices about how to help loved ones with severe mental illness.
The medieval religious framework that could reinterpret some forms of mental distress as spiritual experience was both enabling people to find meaning in suffering and potentially preventing them from receiving medical help, just as our modern frameworks enable and constrain in their own ways. We can honor the genuine compassion and effort of medieval people while acknowledging the limitations of their understanding, and we can hope that future generations will extend the same courtesy to us, recognizing that we too were doing our best with the knowledge and resources we had, even when our best fell short of what was needed. The long view of history also reminds us that progress is neither inevitable nor linear, and that gains can be lost if not carefully maintained. The classical medical knowledge that informed medieval practice was itself a recovery of earlier learning that had been partially lost, and some of the more sophisticated approaches to mental illness that developed in the late medieval period would be lost again in the early modern period when witch hunts and harsh treatment of the mentally ill intensified in many regions. Our own advances in understanding and treating mental illness are not guaranteed to continue or to be maintained. They depend on continued investment in research, education, and care, on social commitment to supporting vulnerable populations, and on cultural attitudes that value all human beings regardless of their mental state. The medieval period shows us both the worst of what can happen when ignorance, fear, and cruelty prevail in responses to mental illness, and the best of what can happen when compassion, curiosity, and commitment to care guide responses, even when understanding is limited. The question for our own time is which of these legacies we will carry forward and build upon. As we conclude this long journey through the landscape of medieval mental health, we should remember the countless individuals whose names we don't know and whose stories weren't recorded, the ordinary people who struggled with depression, anxiety, psychosis, trauma, and other forms of mental distress during those 1,000 years of medieval history. We've talked about theories and treatments, institutions and laws, but behind all of that were human beings who suffered, who hoped for relief, who were cared for or neglected, who found meaning or despaired, who survived or didn't. Some of them might have lived rich lives despite their mental health challenges, supported by loving families and accepting communities, their struggles acknowledged but not defining them entirely. Others might have lived in terrible isolation and suffering, their pain unrelieved and uncomprehended, their humanity barely recognized by those around them. Most probably fell somewhere between these extremes, knowing both kindness and cruelty, both understanding and misunderstanding, both hope and despair. They were as fully human as we are, with the same capacity for feeling, the same need for connection and meaning, the same fundamental dignity, even when their minds worked differently or when psychological suffering overwhelmed them. The medieval period was their time, and they navigated it as best they could with the resources available to them. Some of them found healing, some found accommodation, some found meaning in their suffering, and some found only continued pain. Their experiences, as much as we can reconstruct them across the centuries, remind us that mental health has always been part of the human condition, that every society must find ways to respond to it, and that how we treat our most vulnerable members reveals our deepest values and our truest character. The story of mental health in medieval times is ultimately a story about human beings trying to understand and respond to suffering under conditions of limited knowledge and limited resources, using the conceptual tools and practical means available to them. It's a story that includes ignorance and insight, cruelty and compassion, failure and success, all mixed together in complicated ways that resist simple judgment. It's a story that connects to our own time, because we too are trying to understand and respond to mental health challenges, and we too work with incomplete knowledge and inadequate resources, even if our understanding is far more advanced than medieval understanding.
It's a story that should make us grateful for the progress that has been made while remaining humble about how much we still don't know and how much better we could still do.
It's a story that reminds us that people with mental illness are not a separate category of humans, but are us, our family members, our friends, our neighbors, ourselves, and that how we respond to mental health challenges is one measure of our civilization's achievements and failures. The medieval period, for all its limitations, recognized at its best that caring for the sick, including the mentally sick, was a moral obligation and a spiritual duty, a recognition that remains as important today as it was 1,000 years ago, even if we now have better means to fulfill that obligation. As we've seen tonight, medieval people developed multiple frameworks for understanding mental health, from humoral medicine to religious interpretation to folk belief, and they created various institutions and practices for responding to it, from family care to monastic hospitals to pilgrimage shrines. None of these were adequate by modern standards, but all represented genuine attempts to grapple with real human suffering, and all contributed something to the long historical process through which humanity has slowly developed better understandings and better responses to mental health challenges. The story continues beyond the medieval period, of course, through the early modern era with its witch hunts and first asylums, through the Enlightenment with its new philosophical frameworks for understanding mind and body, through the 19th century with its development of psychiatry as a medical specialty, through the 20th century with its revolutions in treatment and ongoing failures of care, and into our own time with our continuing struggles to adequately address mental health. But that's a story for another night, and we've already spent many hours together exploring just one chapter of this long history. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, thank you for your patience and attention as we've explored what mental health was like in medieval times. We've covered the classical medical theories that shaped medieval understanding, particularly the doctrine of the four humors that dominated medical thinking for over 1,000 years. We've examined the religious frameworks through which medieval people understood mental distress, seeing how Christianity shaped interpretations of suffering while also providing resources for compassion and care. We've looked at folk beliefs and superstitions about madness, curses, and healing that coexisted with more learned traditions. We've tried to reconstruct what lived experience might have been like for people with various mental health conditions in medieval times, from depression and anxiety to psychosis and developmental disabilities. We've surveyed the treatments available, from dietary changes and herbal remedies to prayer and pilgrimage to the harsh reality of restraint and confinement. We've considered how gender, class, region, and other factors shaped experiences of mental illness and responses to it. We've reflected on the economic dimensions of mental health in a subsistence society with no safety net. We've thought about the complicated relationship between mysticism and mental illness in medieval spirituality. And we've tried to find lessons from medieval history that might be relevant to our own time's struggles with mental health. Throughout this long exploration, I hope you've gained not just information about a historical period, but also a deeper appreciation for the complexity of mental health as a human challenge that every society must face, and perhaps also a bit more compassion, both for the medieval people who struggled with limited understanding and for ourselves as we continue to struggle with challenges that remain formidable even with all our modern knowledge. Mental health is part of what it means to be human,
and understanding its history is part of understanding ourselves.
Thanks for watching this video. Good night.